History is not all about names and dates. It's about humanity's greatest stories. Fiction and primetime TV have nothing on the real stories that put them all to shame. This is a delicious appetizer that can be filling on its own, but leaves you wanting more. Like nachos. History nachos. There are times when injustice is so blatant that it warrants direct action. This man knew the horrors of conquest and enslavement, because at first, he was on the side doing it. However, he gave up all his slaves after witnessing the subjugation of the New World, and devoted the rest of his life to abolishing slavery and oppression. He crossed the Atlantic to personally plead his case before the Crown, which appointed him to lead an investigation into the colonial abuses occurring in the New World. For the rest of his life, he would greatly influence the policies created to set standards for colonizers and rein in brutality. He is considered one of the early advocates of an idea that still highly impacts the modern world: universal human rights. Welcome to Episode 5, the Goodwill Toward Men Christmas Special. Bartolome de las Casas. You must be the change you wish to see in the world. Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi was absolutely right on that one. More than 500 years ago, the same principle transformed a conquering slave owner into one of the most effective advocates for human rights of his time. Bartolome de las Casas was born in Spain in 1484. He was part of the Spanish nobility right when Spain began coming into its own as an empire, and received a top-rate education. He was just 8 when Columbus returned from the first voyage to the New World. His father and uncles were on Columbus's second voyage and managed to claim some land in the West Indies, now known as the Caribbean. In 1502, Bartolome left Spain to join his father as one of the first settlers of the New World. He was only 18 when he crossed the Atlantic in an expedition led by the new governor. Hernan Cortez was actually supposed to be on the same voyage, but couldn't make it due to a recent injury. This fleet was over 30 ships, the largest yet sent to the New World. Discovery was done. Now it was time for conquest and settlement. For the next decade, Bartolome helped run his father's estate and acquired slaves. He was in the West Indies when conquest and disease wiped out 90% of the native population. A small group of Dominican friars showed up and started denouncing the enslavement of the natives. Bartolome was a man of faith, and even became an ordained priest, but he disagreed with the condemnation of colonization. In his late 20s, Bartolome saw action as a military chaplain during one of the tribal conflicts, and witnessed massacres of the natives. The Cow incident in particular disturbed Bartolome. It was bad even by colonial conquest standards. At Cow, Bartolome saw the soldiers draw their swords without provocation and kill hundreds of unarmed men, women, and children in a matter of minutes. He pleaded with the commanding officer to order them to stop, but the officer dispassionately let it happen. That is the moment Bartolome started to question his whole belief system. Maybe those Dominican friars had a point after all. The only good thing to come out of Cow was that word of Bartolome's pleas spread quickly among the natives. He became a symbol of hope and peace, and the mere mention of his name prevented a good deal of violence. Bartolome was conflicted because his whole livelihood depended on the existing system. He was becoming a rich man, set for life with plenty of land and slaves. However, the Dominican priests had gotten word of the abuses back to the king in Spain, and the crown began to curb the worst of it. Make no mistake, there was still plenty of room for cruelty, just not at a level that was embarrassing even for the times. This gave serious credence to the idea that the colonists had gone too far. Bartolome eventually settled on being against the massacres, but fine with slavery. He also made a point to treat his slaves much better than was customary. Everything turned around for Bartolome at age 29. He was asked to give a big sermon for Pentecost, and in the process, naturally, he was reading the Bible, specifically the Book of Sirach. Sirach is a book recognized by Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians, but not Protestants. Why would be a whole other episode. Anyway, back to Bartolome. While preparing the sermon, Bartolome came across a passage that flipped his world upside down. Quote, "If you offer as a sacrifice an animal that you have obtained dishonestly, it is defective and unacceptable. The Most High gets no pleasure from sacrifices made by ungodly people. No amount of sacrifices can make up for their sins. Anyone who steals an animal from the poor to offer as a sacrifice is like someone who kills a boy before his father's eyes. Food means life itself to poor people, and taking it away from them is murder. It is murder to deprive someone of his living or to cheat an employee of his wages." Sirach 34:18-22. Think about reading that as a slave owner who had seen the horrors Bartolome witnessed. It basically said that anything resulting from slavery and conquest he donated to the church would actually be a bad thing, and owning slaves was tantamount to murder. For someone of deep Christian faith, that's a problem. Underneath it all, Bartolome was an intellectually honest guy with a conscience. He racked his mind trying to reconcile his faith with his lifestyle and everything he had been taught, but came up short. That's when the light bulb went on. No matter what the government or his fellow Spaniards said, their actions against the natives were wrong. Bartolome then made a fateful decision. He gave up his slaves. He could not outright free them, which is what Bartolome really wanted. Instead, Bartolome made arrangements for his slaves not to be treated cruelly, which was the best he could do. The governor tried to talk Bartolome out of it, but Bartolome threw the book at him. Having a priest tell you to your face he hopes you rot in hell would be a jarring experience. The governor backed down and took the slaves. Bartolome never had a "great, now what" moment. He immediately knew the next step was to take his case to the top, which meant leaving for Spain and crossing the Atlantic. One problem: now he had no slaves and no income. Even after selling everything of real value, he couldn't afford a transatlantic voyage and living in Spain. Enter Pedro de la Renteria. Renteria was wealthy, politically connected, and Bartolome's next-door neighbor. Bartolome and Renteria became best friends to the point they shared assets. Like Bartolome, Renteria came to the same conclusions and did what he could to make the lives of his slaves better. Renteria agreed to fund Bartolome's journey by selling a huge amount of his assets. For those of you wondering why Renteria didn't give up his slaves and go to Spain too, it was a pragmatic decision. To make a long story short, for the plan with Bartolome to work, someone needed to stay behind and keep making money to fund the other one going to Spain. Renteria knew how to run a business, and Bartolome was an incredible public speaker, so they agreed Bartolome should go to Spain. Even with Renteria's help, the odds were against Bartolome. Just about every powerful person in Spain had an active financial interest in colonization. There would be very few sympathetic to his cause. Bartolome knew that his ideas could get him killed, which is why before leaving, he drafted up documents to be released in the event of his death. Just to get out of the Caribbean alive, he had to tell everyone he was leaving for law school. On his way out of the Caribbean, Bartolome met with the Dominican friars who had first started him down the path of righteousness. They celebrated his mission, clued him into the biggest power players, and chose someone to join Bartolome, Antonio de Montesinos. Montesinos shared Bartolome's sympathy for the natives, had experience advocating for them in Spain, and had connections. One of the first things Montesinos did when he and Bartolome arrived in Spain was introduce Bartolome to Diego de Deza, a Dominican archbishop highly favored by the king. The plight of the natives had become a signature issue for the Dominican order, and Deza loved what Bartolome was trying to accomplish. Bartolome had his first ally. Deza wrote a glowing letter to the king about Bartolome and his cause, but did not stop there. He also wrote letters to influential people in the palace. Bartolome was granted a brief audience with the king, but that meant being around the courtiers. Before going, Montesinos clued in Bartolome about who was on his side, who needed to be schmoozed, and who to just stay away from. Bartolome was not meeting with any ordinary king. He was meeting King Ferdinand, as in the guy who hired Columbus. Ferdinand was horrified when news of the massacres first came to him in the early days of colonization, and made rules to stop the worst of them. So there was a chance he would sympathize with Bartolome. There was also a chance Ferdinand would put his own power and wealth above everything else, which would make Bartolome a dead man. Ferdinand had not changed. He was appalled at Bartolome's account, and immediately ordered another audience to explore the matter in detail. Word of Bartolome's cause spread, and it became a huge issue of debate. Everything was going according to plan. Then came the curveball. Ferdinand died before the second audience. Ferdinand specified in his will that Cardinal Ximenes de Cisneros was to act as regent during the transition of power, since the heir to the throne was halfway across Europe. Cisneros served as one of Ferdinand's most influential advisors, and was second only to the king in power and wealth. Undeterred, Bartolome took his case to Cisneros. Unlike the king, Cisneros was already fully aware of what was really going on. Now he finally had a chance to do something about it, so he declared public debates and let Bartolome loose on his opponents. Bartolome shredded everyone who went against him, so Cisneros ordered new laws to be drawn up. He appointed 3 men to draft them: Bartolome, Montesinos, and a famous judge. The new laws were written simply and designed to really dial back the exploitation. Cisneros then granted Bartolome the official title Protector of the Indians, and put him in charge of an investigation to make sure the rules were followed, which sent Bartolome back to the Caribbean. However, Bartolome's investigation team was not made of his guys. They were neutral monks for political reasons, but politics messed things up anyway. Bartolome's opponents got to his team, and they became pretty ineffective. When Bartolome tried to get his team back on track, they thought he was blowing everything out of proportion. There were even top officials who refused to believe the atrocities Bartolome recounted were even possible. Personally, I think Bartolome's team didn't want to believe their countrymen were capable of such things. Bartolome wasn't exactly Mr. Popular when he returned home. Just about everyone turned on him, including his own team. Eventually, Bartolome threw up his hands, said, "Screw this," and went back to Spain to lean on the big muckety-mucks. By this time, the new king was taking over, so Bartolome networked his way into an audience again. The young man who had just ascended the throne was Charles V, one of the most powerful men in history, since he inherited the Americas, about half of Europe, and a bunch of colonies all over the world. In terms of lucky birth, this dude won the lottery, even by royalty standards. Bartolome convinced King Charles to set aside some land in northern South America for an experiment, a colony where Indians were free and allowed to live alongside the Spanish. His opponents wanted to put the kibosh on that idea, since it jeopardized the whole colonial system. To make a long story short, Bartolome struggled to recruit people for his idea, his political adversaries sabotaged the effort, and the local natives attacked because other Spaniards were raiding the area for slaves. His ideal society barely lasted a year. The experience broke Bartolome. He was 36 when all this went down. He gave up advocacy and joined a monastery in the Caribbean. He would remain there for 10 years. While in the monastery, he decided to begin writing down what he had witnessed colonizing the Caribbean. We know it as the History of the Indies, one of the main primary sources for the early colonization of the New World. He made sure it was not published until after his death, so he could be honest without fear of reprisal. While in the monastery, Bartolome still wrote long letters to Spain advocating for the natives once every couple of years. He also came up with a formal doctrine for peacefully spreading the gospel to the natives. Bartolome decided to try it out in an area of unusually violent natives. The Spaniards had nicknamed it the Land of War and steered away. Bartolome was allowed to go in and do things his way. And it worked. At the same time, political pressure finally got through to the Pope, who officially declared the natives recognized as human beings, ordered they be taught the gospel, and condemned enslaving natives. The Pope had declared the natives to have human rights, and used language similar to Bartolome's works. This gave Bartolome hope again. Maybe he wasn't fighting a lost cause after all. Bartolome spent the next few years spreading his peaceful methods, then went back to Spain and got back in the advocacy game. Within 2 years, Charles V signed the new laws, which formalized native rights and mandated phasing out enslavement of the natives. Bartolome had just turned 58. After nearly 30 years, he finally got the crown to acknowledge and enforce the rights of the natives. Several provisions would quickly be walked back, but the genie was out of the bottle. The natives had rights. In recognition of his efforts, Bartolome was appointed as a bishop in the New World. After his retirement, he moved back to Spain. For the rest of his life, he was a prominent advocate for the natives and one of Charles V's top advisors on matters in the Caribbean. He lived to age 82, no small feat in the 1500s. Bartolome had succeeded. The Western world now officially recognized the humanity of the natives. After a rocky start, Bartolome saw the error of his ways and embodied the change he desired. His views defied his culture, his peers, and the status quo of history. Bartolome's belief in universal human dignity is now simply presumed by much of the modern world. Through sheer determination, he established ground rules to prevent colonial abuses and set events in motion that eventually led to the abolition of slavery. In pursuit of his cause, Bartolome made powerful enemies on 3 continents and crossed the Atlantic many times when it was still incredibly dangerous. Bartolome possessed the high level of resiliency and bravery that comes from a strong belief in a just cause. He gave up everything and risked his life constantly to stop the horrors inflicted on his fellow man. That is why Bartolome de las Casas embodies the phrase, goodwill toward men. As always, we would love to hear your feedback. You can email us at historynachos@gmail.com. We also have pages on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Patreon, and PayPal. Please consider making a donation to support making more episodes. Any amount is greatly appreciated. The links are in the description. For those of you that want more details of Bartolome's story, he was a prolific writer. History of the Indies was his lifelong project, which he instructed not to be released until after his death. Bartholomew de las Casas, His Life, Apostolate, and Writings by Francis Augustus MacNutt, provides a highly detailed biography of Bartolome and uses a variety of sources. For anyone doing research, it is a goldmine. A link to the PDF is in the description. Bartolome is most famous for A Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies, which shocked Europe with its vivid description of atrocities in the New World. Be warned, it is exceptionally graphic. Naturally, MacNutt included it in his book as Appendix 1. Or, of course, you can look it all up online. Merry Christmas, and happy holidays to everyone. Until next time, thanks for listening.